Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Classic Gaming Brothers. I'm Zach.
And I'm Seth.
And we're the Classic Gaming Brothers.
That's right, we are the Classic Gaming Brothers.
That's right.
That's right.
Seth, how are you?
Yes, I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
All right, you're going to ask me some questions?
Yeah, I was going to ask you what game you've been recently playing.
Well, recently I've been playing a game called No Bodies. It was released back in September 30th of 2019. It's a puzzle point-and-click adventure game.
Ooh.
Where you get to cover up government-sanctioned assassinations. Get it? No bodies.
Oh,
you're
I
covering
do
them
get
up.
it.
So you get to hide the bodies, destroy the evidence, and do all that stuff. And it's kind of like if Crime Scene Cleaner had a child with a Golden Idol.
Oh, okay.
But it was also a mobile game.
Okay.
It's got like that like mobile art, you know, like the art style that's like clearly a mobile game. Like where it's like kind of cartoony and, you know, it just feels like a mobile game.
I get that. Okay.
So far, I've been having a pretty good time. There is some weird VSync issues where even on Steam, it doesn't have the options to adjust like VSync and all those type of graphic settings. You can only just change your resolution. So I get weird tearing effects when I play the game. So ultimately, it's not too bad that it's just enough to be annoying. But the game's like $6. So, you know, it's fine for being $6. I may actually just end up buying it on my phone and playing it there and either keeping the Steam copy and forgetting about the $6 I spent or returning it and keeping it on the phone because I think it probably would be a better phone experience. And mobile games on the phone are still games. So yeah, it's been pretty fun. I recommend it if you need anything to fill in your time with any sort of puzzling or cleaning up crimes and all of that jazz.
That sounds good.
Zach, what have you recently been playing?
Seth, recently I've been playing Planet X16.
Oh, I know that game.
You might, yes. And if you are fans of the 8-Bit Guy out there, you would also know this game. It's released in 2023 by the 8-Bit Guy, also known as David Murray, the YouTuber who talks a lot about old computers and other technology. Planet X16 is a real-time strategy game that David Murray built for his Commander X16 computer. The Commander X16 is what David has referred to as his dream computer. It's a 6502 8-bit computer, but kind of made with all off-the-shelf parts. It is compatible with Commodore Basic, not Commodore Programs, Commodore Basic, and it also is significantly faster than 8-bit computers of the time. But it is a cool little thing that he's putting together. It's not necessarily something that I don't think I'm going to ever pick up. Maybe I will when it starts to become a bit less expensive. It's currently a little bit high on the price point, but some of the games on it are interesting. Planet X16 being one of them. Planet X16 is built for the Commander X16. It is an 8-bit real-time strategy game, and when you buy it on Steam, like I did, it actually will run through an X16 emulator. It's fun, though. You do your usual strategy game stuff, like building a base, mining minerals, creating an army, and wiping out the enemy. Unlike his previous game, Planet X3 for MS-DOS, which I previously talked about as a recently played many episodes ago, Planet X16 does have mouse support, and frankly, that's a godsend. I think Planet X3 is very fun, but the fact that it doesn't have mouse support does make the game a little harder to get into, in my opinion, especially for someone like me who is a fan of real-time strategy games like Dune 2 or Warcraft 2 or Command & Conquer. Mouse support just does make a real-time strategy game all the more easy. So having it for Planet X16 has been nice. It's been a fun game. It's got beautiful graphics, some great music, and it's definitely worth trying out if you are a fan of real-time strategy games and are also interested in the X16 project. And yeah, that is Planet X16.
Nice.
Well, today we're going to be talking about a game series, and we're only going to really be focusing on a few games in the series because it is deep in terms of all the games and the lore, but this is going to be Shining Force and the Shining series. And before we get into the history of these games, Seth, do you want to talk about your memories of the Shining Force games?
So one of my early childhood memories of watching other people play complicated video games, which is what I spent a part of my childhood doing, was watching a friend of the family playing Shining Force. In fact, I believe this friend of the family was playing the copy of Shining Force that we now own through you, because you own a copy of Shining Force that was gifted to us as a family that you have kept as yourself. However, I watched it played on the original Genesis that it was bought for by our friend of the family who's a bit older than us, and he was playing through it, and I really was drawn to, in Shining Force, at some point in time in the game you can get a jelly creature as part of your party, and the jelly creature gets like frozen powers and stuff like that, and I was just really drawn to the jelly creature. Kind of reminded me of a Flump from Dungeons and Dragons, which are like jelly-like creatures, and I thought the art style was really cool. I liked the way the Shining Force game plays, and we'll talk about this, is that there's an overhead map where you move your characters around, and then it zooms into each of the individual fights that your characters are having, and I just thought the art style for the fights that were like zoomed in on was always just so cool. I thought all the characters looked cool. I still to this day, like, I'll play some Shining Force and really just enjoy all the zoom in of the art styles, and just the fighting is just a pure bliss. I have made multiple attempts to beat the game. I'm not incredibly very good at it. Like, I'm not good at most games, so I haven't. The last time that I was making progress through the game, the power cord was unceremoniously ripped out of the wall by accident. I was an adult. Somebody didn't do this to me purposely, like that happens when you're kids. It was pulled out by accident from someone. So ultimately I lost the progress in that game, and I haven't gotten back to playing it then. So maybe that'll be something for my 2025 resolutions that I won't accomplish.
Yeah, makes sense. In terms of my memories, yeah, I mean, a lot of them are similar to Seth's, but rather I just remember when we got Shining Force and Shining Force 2 from the family friends along with the Sega Genesis they gave us. I remember watching Seth play Shining Force 2 a bit, and I remember playing Shining Force 1 myself a bit. I definitely really liked the art style. I really liked the gameplay, and I also liked the music. One thing, though, I thought was always fun was with the world of Shining Force, you have kind of a mixture of fantasy creatures and humans living together, and it's just kind of established they do live together, and I really like that. Like, I don't know how to describe it. Like, the knights in Shining Force tend to be centaurs, and the archers are elves, and you'll see centaurs just like walking around a normal town, and I kind of like that blend of different fantasy creatures and fantasy races mixing together, as opposed to how some fantasy stories will segregate them with like centaur communities where only the centaurs live, or orc communities where only the orcs live. And I kind of like it when you have these worlds where these characters are blending together. And one thing I also liked about Shining Force was just the aesthetic. The characters were kind of all colorful, they were really fun, and they weren't necessarily kind of realistic looking. They had kind of cartoony looks to them. But overall, I thought it's a fun game, and one that, at least as of last episode, I'm looking forward to at least revisiting hopefully this year. Now, to get into the history of Shining Force, the Shining Force or Shining series has a long history, and Seth and I, as our memories showed, we're mostly familiar with the Sega Genesis games Shining Force and Shining Force 2. In fact, those aren't even the only Shining games on the Sega Genesis. There's another one that we didn't have, which we'll talk a little bit about. But we're really going to focus our attention on Shining Force and Shining Force 2, because that's where a lot of our familiarity is with, and we're not going to get too into the sequels that followed, though we will, of course, touch upon them. We do have to be a bit pedantic, though, so we do have to talk about the history prior to the first Shining Force, and that is the fact that the games were developed by Climax Entertainment, with some work being later done by Sonic Software Planning, though, as a spoiler alert, Sonic Software Planning and Climax Entertainment are very closely tied to each other, with the lead producer for the Shining Force series being the founder of Sonic Software Planning. Climax Entertainment started in Tokyo back in 1990, and it was a very small studio with around 20 staff employed by 1996. One of their very first games would be Shining in the Darkness, the first game in the Shining series. Sega had wanted to put out a dungeon crawler style game and would award Climax Entertainment with a small budget to develop this game. Producer Hiroyuki Takayashi noted that the budget was incredibly tight, and because it was so tight, he had to do the majority of the work himself besides things like the programming. He was also heavily inspired by wizardry, and he really wanted to create a game that had a sense of realism to it, and not necessarily realism in terms of graphics. He wanted the realism in the sense that you could walk around a world and explore dungeons in a first-person perspective. Shining in the Darkness would release in 1991 and featured gameplay similar to that of wizardry in the sense that it is combat and exploration done from a first-person perspective. However, unlike in a first-person shooter like in Doom, everything's like static. It's almost like you're watching a PowerPoint presentation where like a monster will appear in front of you and it might have a little bit of animation, but besides that, it just kind of stays in place. And then when you move forward, the screens kind of move one at a time, like one frame at a time.
We actually have wizardry on our to-do list. So sometime this year, you'll hear an episode just about wizardry. So if you're wondering what this wizardry game is about, have no fear. The Classic Gaming Brothers will be here.
That's true. Now, Shining in the Darkness is set in the kingdom of Thornwood in the mystical land of Rune, I believe is the name of the land. And in the kingdom of Thornwood, the king's daughter has been kidnapped along with the main character's father. An evil sorcerer, Dark Soul, has arrived and threatens the kingdom. And a fun twist that is revealed in the Game Gear game, Shining Force Gaiden: The Final Conflict, is that the character you play as in Shining in the Darkness is the son of the main villains from Shining Force.
Fun. Now, Shining in the Darkness not only would score well, but it also sold fairly well. By the end of the year, it managed to sell about 300,000 copies. The magazine Sega Pro would rank the game at 93%, and Dragon gave it a 4 out of 5 stars, and Sega Force gave it a 90%. Sega didn't seem to care too much that the game was a success, as when it came to the sequel, Climax was once again given a very minimal budget. Takahashi would use the game Dragon Quest as an inspiration for Shining Force, which makes sense because Dragon Quest was insanely popular, and Takahashi had previously worked on the Dragon Quest games when he was employed at Enix. So essentially, Sega was like, hey, Takahashi, can you make Dragon Quest but for us? And he said, yes.
And he said, can we have money?
And they said, no. They said, listen, we got bills to pay, but you need to make us some successful money.
We got bills to pay, and you're not the top of those bills.
Yeah, that's usually what happens when you have a conversation, when you make a lot of money for a company and you need some money to do something, they tend to all of a sudden forget all the money that you made them. But anyway, in an interview with the website GamesTM, Takahashi noted that in 1992, the quote-unquote game industry's way of thinking about role-playing games put the emphasis squarely on telling an interesting story. However, Takahashi felt it important to put an emphasis on engaging combat. In the interview, he noted that you may see many role-playing games that are designed according to a philosophy where battles are just a bonus. I could never accept that, and I wouldn't go along with it. He also pulled inspiration from an obscure Japanese PC game called Silver Fox, which just sounds like Spy Fox if he was old. Now, despite not being a fan of tactical games, which Silver Fox was, Silver Fox intrigued him, and Takahashi wanted to incorporate the way you oversee and command multiple characters into his game that he was working on. He states in the interview that Silver Fox was the title that convinced me simulation games didn't have to be crap, which I think is fair praise for bringing someone from a genre that they don't like to basing a game that they were developing on, or at least heavily influencing it. Takahashi wanted to be challenged with the development of Shining Force, feeling that it was important to make something entirely new. This did, however, initially result in a fairly intensive game, with half of the 4 megs of ROM being used by the title screen and the battle screen. Now, despite the complications, the game would release in March of 1992. The story is set in the land of Rune, with the start of the game taking place in the kingdom of Gardenia. You play as Max, who I believe is like a blonde-haired man who kind of looks like an almost elfish in look. He's got a flowing cape though, and he's when he acts in his battle screen, he always like does a jump up and all that stuff.
Yeah, he is human, but he looks like Link.
He's got like that elfish human quality. There is an elf that joins your party who looks more like an elf, like a stereotypical elf, who's an archer, but Max looks like a half elf. But anyway, you play as Max, and he's sent on this mission to stop Kane, the WWE wrestler, from opening the Shining Path and resurrecting the Dark Dragon. You recruit various allies and battle your way through the game, which is probably the best part of the game, is recruiting allies. And in fact, the best part of most games. I feel like building the team is like pretty much the like rising action of a lot of games, and rising action's a lot of fun to go through. So whether it be Shining Force, Octopath Traveler, or Final Fantasy, you're always kind of building a group of people to work together to simultaneously strike at something.
I do love how in these early RPGs, though, how easy it is to convince people to join your party, because you'll walk into a bar, you'll see a guy, you'll be like, hey, you want to go kill someone with me? And they'll say, sure.
That just makes me think of the shadow noise from Final Fantasy VI.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, through recruiting these various allies, you soon learn that Kane and King Rummelad are under the control of the evil Dark Soul, unrelated to the Dark Soul from Shining in the Darkness, but related to the protagonist of Shining in the Darkness.
It's so weird. In Shining in the Darkness, the villain is named Dark Soul, but he's not the same Dark Soul as Shining Force. They just have similar names.
Maybe they're from the same litter. Now, the gameplay of Shining Force is similar to later games under the tactical RPG genre. In fact, it's fairly similar to Fire Emblem, which often gets compared to Shining Force, or vice versa.
Now, in Shining Force, you control a party of adventurers, which is very similar to other RPG games, and you can level up your party, also similar to other RPG games. Where the difference comes between Shining Force and a game like Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy is in the way combat is presented. Combat in Shining Force is done on a grid. Each of your party members are allotted a certain number of move points based on a variety of factors like their class, their race, etc. And you're also given a turn to either attack, use a magic, or I think you can just wait. So you can move and attack. That's what you do. Some characters, like archers, can shoot enemies who are a few squares away from them. Characters who wield swords and stuff can only attack directly next to them. Other characters equipped with like lances, like there's a centaur you can have that has a lance, can not only throw the lance, but also do close range attacks. Magic users can also do larger ranges for attacks and have a bit more of a wider spread. But as mentioned, some of these characters might not be able to move as far as another character. So your centaur might be able to move further than your guy walking on 2 feet.
Friggin' Luke.
Yeah, Luke is very slow.
There is a lot of characters in the game. There's in fact 30 that are able to join your party at one point in time. And they're also like not only the 30 that you can find throughout the game, but there's also like secret characters, and the jellyfish is one of those secret characters, and his name is Domingo, who is a flying jellyfish. As Zach mentioned, there's centaurs, but there's also elves and dwarves. There's also other humans. There's even a baby dragon and a fox person and all sorts of mystical creatures. There's also Jorkit, who is like a small woodland creature with a helmet. There's bird creatures. There's 2 dwarves, Jort and Luke, for sure, that Zach would remember. They end up being one's like a guy who hits things, which is Jort, and Luke is the kind of like I think they're both dwarves that just hit things. And there's also wizards like Tao, who joins your group.
I like Gong, who's the half giant. He's the monk.
Oh, yes. Semi-secret character. And there's Eamon and Barbary, who are some bird creatures.
Oh, Hans is the one I remember. That's the one that looks like a Link. He's got the really pointy ears for an elf.
Yes. Hans is the elf-looking creature. Max only kind of looks like an elf in the battle mode.
And Gunts. Gunts is an armadillo that wears armor. He kind of looks like Rocket Knight, except like more decked out with armor.
And I believe he is the slowest, or one of the slowest ones. I like that Gunts doesn't join your group because his armor's not ready.
Yeah, it's fun.
I'll be there with you guys eventually.
Now, enemies will also, of course, get a turn. So what happens is your party moves, your party attacks, the enemies move, the enemy attacks. A tactical RPG like Shining Force, I would say, is more similar to playing a game like Dungeons and Dragons than Final Fantasy is compared to playing Dungeons and Dragons, in my opinion. I think a tactical RPG tends to have a bit more of a familiar role-playing, like tabletop style to it in terms of like the move points and the attacks. Now, the game was successful on release, and it was also praised by critics. By April of 1992, it had topped Famitsu's sales charts. Sega Pro would rank it 93%, Game Informer would give it 8 out of 10, and Power Unlimited gave it 89%. And in the years since, it's still been praised, with game rankings holding the Genesis version at 80%. And when it came to developing the official sequel, like before, Sega didn't seem to care. They once again allotted Takahashi with a minimal budget. At this point, Takahashi was now the founder of Sonic Software Planning. So Sonic Software Planning would be the company that would handle Shining Force 2. They're also the company that handled a bunch of Shining Force games that happened in between, because there were actually 2 Shining Force games that came out between Shining Force and Shining Force 2. Those were the Game Gear games, Shining Force Gaiden in 1992 and Shining Force The Sword of Haja in 1993. Both Game Gear games, like the games that preceded it, sold well and scored well. And here's the thing, Sega said, we understand you're making a 5th game in this successful, highly praised franchise. We're still going to give you the least amount of money that we can give you to make the sequel. Takahashi has noted in his interview with Games TM that he was anxious going into production of Shining Force 2, largely because of this budgetary problem. He knew that if they couldn't produce another hit, they would have no future. In fact, a majority of staff who had worked on the previous Shining series had already left because of the issues they were having and had been replaced. So there was definitely some hesitancy and fear going into it, especially because Sega didn't seem to have a lot of faith, despite the fact that they had already put out 4 games that did well. One of his goals with Shining Force 2, per the interview, was to improve the story and enhance the game's RPG-ness.
Shining Force 2 carries over the same gameplay as Shining Force. Change is the expansion of non-linear game elements like free roaming. The chapter system was also removed, allowing players to return to different parts of the world that they were previously in. The game was also longer. The website How Long to Beat puts Shining Force at an average of 22 hours and 22 minutes. However, Shining Force 2 has an average of 30 hours and 43 minutes, an entire working day longer. Now, in the canon, the story is set around 40 to 70 years after the events of Shining Force. The game ties into the plot of Shining Force Gaiden Final Conflict, another Game Gear game that would be released in 1995, with the character of Xeon, a devil who helped defeat Dark Soul in Final Conflict. It reminds me of that Xenon in the 21st century. And this devil was seeking his freedom. The game is set in the lands of Parmisia and Grands, specifically in the nation of Grand Seal. Grand Seal Castle is infiltrated by a thief named Slade, who breaks a seal that seals Xeon in. Then, unknown creatures begin attacking the kingdom, and King Grand Seal falls sick. The court advisor, Sir Arstral, and his apprentices, Bowie the Squire, Sarah the Healer, and Chester the Knight, go on a quest to figure out what illness had befallen the King Grand Seal and to stop the evil that threatens the kingdom. There is also up to 30 characters that you can acquire through Shining Force 2. However, looking at the roster, there is no jellyfish. Slade is a mouse, and Peter, who looks like he's a duckbill creature. And what is interesting is that the art style has kind of changed a little bit, where it's a little more, I feel, based on the artwork that I'm looking at, a little more anime and less fantastical.
Yeah.
That's how the art style, I think, looks for me, at least.
So there is no jellyfish, you're right, but there is Zinc, who is a robot.
Oh, yeah, and Claude, who looks like Thing. Anyway, Shining Force 2 would become a bestseller in Japan and receive some, at the time, mixed reviews from the American audience. EGM gave the game a 6.8 out of 10, with one review noting that he felt the game needed more twists. Should have gotten M. Night Shyamalan to write it. GamePro bashed the game, calling it too confusing and generic, and in modern times, though, it has been highly regarded, with IGN naming it 48th best game of all time out of 100, and Retro Gamer ranking it as one of the top 10 Genesis Mega Drive games.
Now, Shining Force didn't end with Shining Force 2. In fact, Shining Force CD would release in 1995, and also released in 1995 was that Game Gear game, Shining Force Gaiden Final Conflict. conflict. Now, Shining Force CD is kind of unique. It's actually a remake of Shining Force Gaiden and Sword of Hajiya. However, it didn't sell very well, and it is fairly expensive. In fact, Shining Force CD for the US loose, not in a case, so just that CD flopping around, goes for $96. CIB $248. The Sega Saturn would see 3 Shining games: Shining Wisdom, Shining the Holy Ark, and Shining Force 3. Shining the Holy Ark is notable in that it was a polygonal dungeon crawler, which is kind of cool. And Shining Force 3 would use polygonal graphics for combat sequences with a 2.5D art style for the overworld. Now, Shining Force 3 would actually be the last Shining Force game released on a Sega console. There weren't any released on the Dreamcast, and then Sega would leave the console market. So when Shining Force Neo was released in 2005, it was released for the Sony PlayStation 2. It was also the first Shining game to not feature Takahashi as a producer, and he actually wasn't involved in any of the remaining Shining games. Following Neo was Shining Force EXA in 2007, Shining Wind, also in 2007, Blade Arcus from Shining in 2014 for the arcade, which was later ported to the PS3, PS4, Windows, and Switch, and Residence Refrain in 2014 for the PS3, later ported to the PS4, Switch, Windows, and Xbox One.
On the Game Boy Advance, Shining Force would be ported to the console in 2004. Another game based on the Shining series, Shining Soul, was released on the GBA in 2002, Shining Soul 2 in 2003, Shining Force Feather in 2009 for Nintendo DS, Shining Hearts in 2010 for the PSP, Shining Blade for the PSP in 2012, and Shining Arc for the PSP in 2013. Outside the video games, Shining Force did see a comic adaptation in one issue of the British Sonic comic that I'm sure Zach has read or owns. There was also an anime adaptation of the game Shining Tears and the Shining Wind, creatively called Shining Tears X Wind, that aired in 2007 and ran for 13 episodes. Another anime, Shining Hearts Shiawase no Pan, was also released in 2012 and ran for 12 episodes. It is about bakers who live in a town set in the Shining series, which I'm sure they have rough lives because the Shining series is always under attack from a great enemy, and you're just trying to be a baker.
It looks like a very cozy anime, though. It's literally just about bakers.
Characters from Shining Force have also appeared in the game Project X Zone, a crossover tactical RPG game from Banpresto.
That's right. And that will really do it for our Shining Force episode. Again, we're really just focused on the games that Seth and I played, Shining Force and Shining Force 2. I mean, I didn't even play Shining in the Darkness until last year or the year before, which was one of my recently plays, I think, when we had a guest on the original Shining Force series. So Shining Force 2, I think they're underrated games for the Sega Genesis. I think they're really good games, and I don't think they get talked about a lot. I just did not keep up with the Shining series after Shining Force 2. Like, I never played Shining Force for the Game Gear. I never played the CD remake of them. I never played the ones on the Saturn. I haven't picked up any of the ones for the PS2. And to be honest, I don't know if I'm that interested. They don't look like the Shining Force I remember, but who knows? Maybe someday I'll try them out. And if there are any Shining fans out there, let us know what we're missing, because I'm curious. If you've played Shining Force Neo and you think it's one of the best RPGs out there and we're missing out on a great game, let us know. Send us an email. We'll be really happy to hear it. But that being said, unless Seth has any other thoughts about the Shining series, we're going to get into our retro rewind. Seth had me play Tony Hawk's Pro Skater for the GBA. It was developed by Vicarious Visions in 2000, and it's a very interesting port of the game that was also released on the PS1 and the N64. The game plays from an isometric perspective and actually uses 3D models, so they are incredibly rudimentary as the GBA was not a powerful console. The controls are a bit more stiff than the other versions of the game, but I thought it was overall okay. However, I don't know if I would necessarily say it holds up. Personally, I think my go-to will always be either the PS1 or N64 versions of the Tony Hawk Pro Skater game. And Pro Skater 2, I think those are just the superior versions of this game, and the N64 will always have a special place in my heart for having that really bit-crushed version of Superman by Goldfinger. Next week, Seth, I want you to play The Flintstones, The Rescue of Dino and Hoppy for the NES.
Great. That sounds like a lot of fun. Zach had me play Top Gear for the SNES, which is part of the racing video game series that was published by Kemco, and not an SNES recreation of the Top Gear show, which would have been great.
Yeah, you just play as Richard Hammond.
Jeremy Clarkson. Oh! Zach had me play specifically Top Gear for the SNES, which was released in 1992 across the 3 major markets, Japan, Europe, and North America. There would be other games in the series, with one planning, in fact, to come out in 2024, which, don't worry, is just a collection. Though the series was seriously developed and released from 1992 up until about 2004 for consoles, where it was released on the SNES, the Sega Genesis, the N64, which saw 4 different Top Gear releases, and the PS2. It also had 5 games released on handhelds, the Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, and the Game Boy DS. The DS game was actually released after the console stopped seeing releases in 2006. And then there was 20 years, and then they finally released a collection of Top Gear games. I played the first one, which was the one that was originally developed by Gremlin Graphics, which were behind a number of games, one of them being Top Gear. Gremlin Graphics is great. We should do an episode on Gremlin Graphics because they are they have developed a lot of games, and they developed it to create Top Gear to be the in Top Gear you had to be the fastest driver in the world. That's the objective. It would be one of the first driving video games to be released on the SNES, and this is really peak early 1990s SNES racing. The game has a number of customization options, up to including 6 different cars, and you are dropped into the last position, and you have to speed through and try to get through to the first place. It's tough, but it's smooth, like a good smooth. I learned also that hitting cars slows you down, so you should try to avoid them to get in front of them. If you're looking for a fun racing game on the SNES, you can't really go wrong with Top Gear. I think it definitely holds up. Though if you don't qualify, game over. It also has it's meant to be played 2 players, but if you play 1 player, then you just get to watch you just get to watch the computer in the bottom half of the screen racing better than you. Or worse than you. Very fun. I enjoy it. It was a good game. No kid gloves, though, for the game. Zach, next week you could play Aerial Assault for the Sega Master System.
Okay, I will. Well, thank you everyone for listening to our episode. Again, if you had any memories of Shining Force or Shining the series, let us know by emailing classicgamingbrothers@gmail.com. You can also visit our website, www.classicgamingbrothers.com, where you can listen to our episodes in our lounge. And if you don't want to listen to them there, you can listen to us wherever podcasts can be found, be it Podbean or iTunes or iHeartRadio. And if you're looking to find us on social media, well, guess what? You can find us everywhere. We're basically on all the social medias, with probably some exceptions. So if you go to a social media and you look up Classic Gaming Brothers or CG Brothers Pod, you're bound to find us. That being said, Seth, am I forgetting anything?
Don't play games like my brother.
And don't play games like my brother.
I've been Seth.
And I've been Zach.
And we've been the Classic Gaming Brothers.
That's right.